He has spoken on the topics faith, family and freedom in Cuba, Belgium, Brazil, Congo, UK and all over the USA to crowds from 14 to 40,000. International leadership speaker, trainer and coach. Author of Learn to Raw Leadership, Attitude Hack, Live a More Excellent Life, 5 Battle Strategies of a Victorious Warrior. 2021 President's Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. Founding partner of the John Maxwell team. Toastmaster International Speech Competition semi-finalist. Founder of Tell It Like It Is TV, ThatGuyRocks.com and ThatGuySpeaks.com. Creator of Story Power TV, Transforming Grace TV, and Leading Leaders Podcast. Producer of 4 TV programs and podcasts for Liftable TV and World Trumpet Television as well as multiple social media channels. Please help me welcome J. Loren Norris.
It's been about 25 years ago, standing on the sidewalk in front of a little print shop in Austin, Texas, about 8 blocks from the Capitol. A guy looks at me and he says, "We're going to start this new thing, and I want you to give up your job and come work for me and do this new thing." And I thought, that sounds like an interesting invitation. Tell me about this new thing. And he said, "Well, I can't tell you until you sign some paperwork, but I think you're going to like it." And I had no idea how close we were to changing the world at that time. But that's what I want to talk about in this episode of Leading Leaders.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.
My name is J. Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast, and I want to tell you about a time that we almost changed the world. I mean, we got really, maybe we made it a little bit of an impact anyway. We had a great idea. How's that? We had a really good idea, and it wasn't even my idea. I just had some ideas to help carry that idea forward. The idea was that we would start a statewide newspaper. The guys that came up with the idea, they already had a very successful newsletter. They were already putting out some information. They were pulling data and history and knowledge and wisdom from areas that most people wouldn't bother to look. You know, sometimes the greatest information, the greatest resources are the ones that you got to dig a little deeper to get your hands on. You got to look past the surface and do your own homework, your own research, your own investigation. And these guys, they were doing that. They were looking at things through a new lens. They were writing newsletters that caused people to go, "Well, wait a minute, that's not what I saw in the news yesterday. That's not what I read in my morning paper. That's not what I heard from my friends." And trust me, this was before the days of the internet and everybody having access to every form of social media where they could spout an opinion in 90 seconds and whatever you think to yourself in the shower should be front page news today. It was long before any of that was happening. But it was in the midst of this battle for the history of our nation, the battle for the future of our nation. And if you think for a moment that those two are separated, you have been deceived, whether by yourself or by somebody else. I'm going to say it like this. There is a reason that political dissidents destroy history. There's a reason for that. There's a reason that they find the archives. There's a reason that they find the historical documents. There's a reason they tear down monuments and statues. There's a reason for that. And the reason is this. Today's narrative is tomorrow's destiny. Today's narrative is tomorrow's destiny. And today's narrative is crafted from yesterday's experiences. Meaning, if everything you know today is based on what you lived through yesterday, what else are you going to do tomorrow? But what if everything you're living through today is based on the conglomerate of what everybody else lived through yesterday, and it's all twisted together in this thing we call history and then moved forward into today's plan. You could call it manifestation. You could call it predictive programming. You could call it prophecy or self-fulfilling prophecy. You could call it, I don't know, law of attraction. Call it whatever you want to. Predictive programming sometimes is that person who says, well, this isn't really the facts or the data of history, but it is what we want you to think that was. Mandela effect, anyone? We could go back and rewrite history by causing you to believe that what you thought about history wasn't actually true. I know what you thought you experienced. I know what you thought you felt. I know what you thought you read or what you learned, but it wasn't true. I mean, right here in the studio, I have encyclopedias from 1968 and from 1988. And I promise you that if I were to go pull any random story out of those encyclopedias and start reading to them, someone today would fact check them using Wikipedia, which is a manipulated platform, and it's not even history. In fact, there are people who pay others to manipulate the data that's in Wikipedia. I know you think I'm crazy. Do a little homework. Dig beyond the surface. Ask more than the surface questions, and you're going to find that there are things about history that you've been straight up been lied to. But not by accident. See, the challenge with this thing we call the narrative is that he who controls the narrative of the history can rewrite what's happening today and plan what's happening for the future. Those stories of history, they're there both to inform us and remind us of what has happened, but they're also there to direct us for what should happen. We should look for those stories of history and go, oh, I learned from that. That was a bad idea. That was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it that way, or we shouldn't have done it that way, or they shouldn't have done that. Either way, the outcome was horrible and we should have had a better plan. But now that we've seen that, we should learn from those mistakes and do it differently. Unfortunately, we're in that 100-year cycle right now. If you were to take the conversations that are happening right now about governance, about relationships, about nationalities, about nation building, about societies and cultures, and just extract them, remove the personalities and the names, and go back 100 years in time, you could overlay that 1900 to 1935 time frame with an uncanny match. I think if you were to study history through that lens, it would frighten you. It would freak you out just a little bit to realize it's almost like a postage stamp. It's the same all the way around. Have you ever studied a postage stamp? It's got those funny little curves around the outside of it. They're all the same. It's manufactured that way. And these stories, they get manufactured that way. These narratives, they get led by certain people. Well, they have that same effect. It's cyclical. It repeats itself. It's identical because it's manufactured that way for a reason. Because whoever controls the narrative controls the future. Whether the narrative is accurate or not is not relevant. If you've got the loudest trumpet, if you've got the biggest newspaper, if you've got the most of those newspapers. Now, there are a lot of people who are looking at the newspaper and saying, well, the newspaper, it was the death of the telegram. And then the radio, that was the death of the newspaper. And then the television, that was the death of the radio. And now we got AI, and that's good. All of these are various mediums and modes and media of communicating the narrative. The challenge is we notice, we recognize, especially those in leadership, that there are some people, and if you've done any marketing research at all, you know this to be true. You might have done like a focus group or a canvas or a survey or a poll and realize that when you ask the same 3 questions in one social media platform versus another, you get completely different results. Ask those of people, those same questions of people who read a newspaper versus read a magazine. Totally different results. Those who watch TV versus listen to radio. Totally different results. Those who watch one particular network versus another particular network, totally different results. And so the question you have to ask is there something wrong with the survey? Is there something wrong with the poll? No, the answer is people's mindsets, their worldviews are so definitively shaped by the media they consume. The television network, the social media platform, the newspaper, the particular newspaper, not just is it newspaper versus magazine, but which newspaper, which magazine, who's it published by, who owns the publishing company, who sits at the top of the top of the top of the top of the building and says to the editorial board, you're not going to publish that article. Oh, and if you think that's not a true story, just go back and, I don't know, do a search in any of your favorite search engines and say which articles were quashed by the publisher, which articles were written and then not published by the publisher. There have been more than one who've been outed, where people have come out and went, I've been trying to tell this story for 10 years and they won't let me tell it. They won't let me write it. They keep lying about it. There have been media people arrested, detained, deported for writing stories that were absolutely factually accurate, but they didn't serve those in power. Political power, financial power, the publishers, the owners of the company. It didn't suit them well, so they didn't want that story out. And that's how you control a narrative. You make the journalists, you can't write about that. So when you have some deviant, defiant, stubborn journalist who says, well, I'm going to publish it anyway. I'm going to take that same story somewhere else. And now that we have social media and multiple platforms, we have newspapers all over the world, we have magazines all over the world, we have handwritten notes and billboards and messages written on cardboard boxes if you're in the right place. We have radio stations and multi-channel broadcasting capabilities and shortwave radio. We have messages that can go all the way around the world via satellite, faster than you can print the next print news article. When we know that, then we have to wonder, how is it possible that if you turn on the news today, out of 20 different news sources, they're all saying the same thing? And I don't just mean ideologically they're similar. I mean, you've probably seen on social media the 27 boxes that pop up on the screen, and all 27 boxes, you can literally audio sync them, their words, different people, different stations, different networks, different parts of the country, but you can literally audio sync them to the way that they're pronouncing the words and the timing that they're saying exactly the same words, like they're simultaneously reading from a script. Who wrote that script? Because whoever controls the narrative controls the future. Who got to write the script? Who gets to decide what was a fact of history? What happened yesterday? Was it shrapnel? Was it a piece of glass? Was that a little blood packet burst and squirted while hiding behind? Or did something nearly disastrous, nearly treacherous actually happen? Well, it depends on the news source you listen to right after, doesn't it? Depends on what their worldview, their ideology, their expectation of your future is. There are some who would say, if it had actually been a successful attempt, that would have been a good thing. And there are others who say, if it had actually succeeded, it would have been chaos beyond measure. And there are others who think, it wasn't me, I don't care. But those who control the narrative, they control your future. Well, recently, 200 radio stations were bought up by someone who's not a citizen of our nation. Now, in the past, because of this project that we were a part of, we set out to make a statewide newspaper. And when we went back to the primary investors and we said, here's what it's going to cost to do this. Here's how long it'll take to get up and running. This is what it'll look like to make that kind of impact. This is the organizational structure that we need to be able to put together, et cetera, et cetera. The investor said, what if instead of a newspaper, we made it radio stations? And so we started jumping through the hoops of finding where the radio stations to buy. How do we buy them? What's the process? What does it cost? How do we get through this process? And we ran into this huge roadblock called the FCC, where the FCC said, hold up. One ideological platform, one worldview, one way of thinking can't own that many radio stations because, well, it'd be like manipulating the narrative. And so slow your roll a little bit. We got to do some research on you. We've got to figure out who you are, what you think about, what you want to say, what you have to say to the world before we decide if you can buy up all these radio stations. That has to get approval. And we said, okay. And so we went forward with our budget and we went forward with our proposal and we were waiting to see what the next step was. And the investor said, well, if it's that complicated to do radio, what about television? And the end result was, after a couple of years of research and hard work, a satellite news organization that gathered the news, all the research and all the deep diving and all the homework and all the interviews and all the work that we talked about in the newsletter. It's now the source of a satellite news company. They're gathering news from all over the world. They're gathering news from all over the city and all over the state, and they're bringing it back and they're making it available to networks through satellite uplink. And we don't have to own all the stations. We don't have to buy all the radio stations. Not nearly as much of an argument with the FCC because now we're just providing a product that these other networks can choose to use or not. Different scenario, different level of access, different level of combativeness. But now that there's somebody else coming in with a different worldview, this same organization that said, slow your roll, said, come on in, more money, more allegiance with your same existing ideologies. That's what it means to control the narrative and then control the future, because what you think happened in history, in all these old encyclopedias I have on my bookshelf, well, maybe it didn't happen like that. Maybe I'll just tell you a different story. Maybe I'll tell you what's convenient for me. That person, they were really a bad guy. I mean, they had some different ideas than you might have today, but you've been misled. I mean, they were geniuses. If you think I'm kidding, you need to go back and do some research on some of the characters who have been major players in the alterations of history. Pol Pot, Mao, Stalin, Marx, Hitler, Mussolini. These names ring a bell. Do you know their worldviews are walking in our Congress today? I'm not kidding. I'm telling you the truth. Do a little homework, do a little research. Ask yourself what AOC describes her own political worldview as. I believe you'll hear her say a socialist Democrat or a democratic socialist. She uses those terms interchangeably. They're not necessarily that far different, but they are drastically different than the republic she supposedly represents. Ilhan Omar, Maxine Waters, Hillary Rodham, what are their worldviews? What is the real worldview of Donald Trump? Where does he get his political ideologies? Where does he come up with this stuff? I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just saying, think, for heaven's sake. Do some homework, do some research. Stop trusting just what you're being fed. Dig deeper, get into the facts, get into the history, and then remember this too. So far as the narrative is concerned, the narrative is made up of, you guessed it, stories. And the stories that come together become the history, like these encyclopedias that I have. They become the history that we look to and go, wow, that's what happened? That's who was involved? That's what they did? That's incredible. And that's how we learn, and that's how we direct our future from the stories of the past. We learn to create a new plan, a new course. We avoid the pitfalls, hopefully, of the past. We avoid the landmines of the past. We learn to make better decisions than we did in the past. Not just individually, but as a nation, as a society, as a culture, as a world. We've got to make better decisions than were made in the past. The things that led to previous wars, how did they start? Why did they start? What was the argument? What was the purpose? What was the point? What was the outcome? How could we do that same conflict differently today? What could we do differently? How could we avoid it? That's what those stories are for. They inform us, they educate us, and they direct us. But see, here's how you, as an individual leader, I don't care if you're leading your household or leading a mega corporation, a global Fortune 500, I don't care. As a leader, story power is your most powerful tool. It's a tool for shaping the mindset of the people who work with you. It's a powerful tool for delivering the vision that you have for your organization. It's a powerful tool for shaping the personalities around you and in you. The stories that you tell to you in the mirror when you're shaving your face, brushing your teeth, combing your hair, those stories will shape the personality of who you are. You've got to be very selective about the stories you tell, though. Selecting the right story to tell, that's just like looking back in the history books and going, which one of these two stories is relevant to the audience I'm speaking to right now? If I'm talking to my 5-year-old, well, they probably need to know what happens when you don't brush your teeth every day, how they fall out, they break, they crumble, they become brittle. That's the story you ought to be telling. But if you're talking to your CFO or your finance officers about how you handle money, you need some different stories than when you brush your teeth or don't, right? That seems like silly illustration. Like duh. I mean, who couldn't figure that out? The stories I tell to my 5-year-old and the stories I tell to my CFO, of course those are different. How about the stories you tell to your sales team or your customer or your business opponents? What do those stories consist of? What about the stories that display your worldview, expose your values, your core values, your deep, abiding, and operating principles? Who do you tell those stories to? Those stories that said, this is the reason I got into this business in the first place. I've invested my time, my talent, my treasure, my attention in this industry because I believe so wholeheartedly that we can make a difference in the world. I don't care if you're selling shoes or shampoo. If you believe in what you're doing, the stories that drove you to make the decisions, to make the sacrifices, to exert the effort, those stories are important to be told. Because he who controls the narrative controls the future. The stories of the things that you have lived through, that is the most powerful weapon we have against tyranny. Because I promise you, there's going to be a day in your life, it may have already come, it may be in the very near future, that something inside of your soul is going to say, it hasn't always been like this. And you'll say that with sadness. But with hope and encouragement and fire, you'll say, but it also will not always be like this. It hasn't always been like this, but it won't always be like this. There is a better day coming because we can learn from the stories of our past. We can take the history of what we lived through and create a new path. We can direct the future. The narrative of yesterday, the narrative of today, that is the destiny of tomorrow. And you have as much right to speak into that destiny as anybody else. You have the history. You have the experiences. Do your homework. Do your research. Commit yourself to know what you're talking about, to tell the stories you've lived through and back them with the evidence of the things that you've been surrounded by, the things that you've observed and researched and learned. And those stories will be rich and powerful for directing the future. You are responsible for the narrative that guides your life. You're responsible for hearing the narratives around you and discerning which ones are important. You're also responsible for telling the stories that you have lived through because those experiences will inform and direct those around you. And they need you. They need to hear that from you. Whoever directs the narrative, controls the narrative, manipulates the narrative, crafts the narrative, they do all those things to your future as well. If you're a leader, lead the narrative. Tell the stories of the things you've lived through, and you can reshape the future for those you care about. I'm J. Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day. And if you like this message, like and subscribe. Share it with somebody else who hasn't heard it before.
Lauren is a master teacher on storytelling, and I learned so much. I'm really going to have to sit down and go back through everything, and I think I might have to have some more coffees with Lauren, but it was totally worth my time, and I really highly recommend it if you're looking to grow your ministry, grow your business, grow your career. Lauren will serve you well.